Welcome to my YouTube channel where I discuss topics related to data science. In this video, we will learn how to perform hierarchical cluster analysis using Python. The fundamental concepts of clustering are first introduced, followed by the implementation of the agglomerative hierarchical clustering using the SciPy and scikit-learn libraries. The quality of the clustering results is then evaluated using a dendrogram before the final clusters are compared with the patterns observed in the earlier principal component analysis. The wine dataset contains measurements from wines belonging to three different cultivars. In this presentation, that data set itself is not used. Instead, the first two principal component scores obtained from the earlier principal component analysis are used as the input for agglomerative hierarchical clustering. The link to the PCA video is provided at the end of this presentation as well as in the video description. In an earlier video, we had seen how principal component analysis reduced the wine dataset to two principal components and revealing visual pattern suggesting three groups. This pattern was also supported when K-means cluster analysis was run on the first and second principal component scores from that wine dataset. Now, we would like to see if another clustering algorithm reaches the same conclusion. As mentioned earlier, the algorithm that will be used is hierarchical clustering, especially the agglomerative approach. Hierarchical clustering is the second major category of clustering methods after prototype-based methods such as K-means, which was discussed in the previous video. Unlike K-means, hierarchical clustering creates a nested structure where large clusters can contain smaller subclusters. This hierarchical relationship is typically displayed as a tree-like diagram called a dendrogram, which provides a useful visual representation of how clusters are formed and how closely they are related. There are two main approaches to hierarchical clustering: divisive and agglomerative. In divisive hierarchical clustering, the algorithm begins with all samples grouped into a single cluster. It then repeatedly divides the data into smaller and smaller clusters until each sample forms its own cluster. Because the process starts with one cluster and progressively splits it, divisive hierarchical clustering is known as a top-down approach. The second is agglomerative hierarchical clustering, in which the algorithm starts with each point as individual clusters and then merges the closest pair of clusters. A notion of cluster proximity is needed for this. The two standard algorithms for agglomerative hierarchical clustering are single linkage and complete linkage. Two other common algorithms are average linkage and Watt's linkage, and how the merging is done is described. The figure illustrates the different distance measures used when deciding which two clusters should be merged. A dendrogram from a study is shown. The key takeaway from this diagram is the one common method for selecting the number of clusters in a dendrogram. This is done by identifying the largest vertical gap in the dendrogram. A horizontal cut is then made within this gap, and the number of branches it intersects determines the number of clusters. This is a heuristic approach rather than a definitive rule. In this example, the largest gap is highlighted by the red arrow, and a cut within this region produces two clusters. The hierarchical clustering algorithm using Watt's linkage follows a series of straightforward steps. It begins by computing the pairwise distance metric and representing each sample as its own cluster. The algorithm then repeatedly merges the closest clusters until only one cluster remains. Euclidean distance is the metric most used to compute the distances between samples. The implementation can be divided into four main stages. First, we import the required libraries and prepare the dataset. Next, we use the dendrogram to estimate the appropriate number of clusters. We then fit the agglomerative hierarchical clustering model. Finally, we visualize and interpret the clustering results. The diagram summarizes the overall workflow used in this implementation. We will now go through each step in detail. The code for running the hierarchical cluster analysis in PyCharm Professional is shown. The first step, as usual, involves importing the common libraries such as NumPy, Matplotlib, as well as Pandas. Recall from the previous video that principal component analysis transforms the original variables into principal components. Here we use X-train reduced, which consists of the PC1 and PC2 scores from that earlier PCA projection as the input for the agglomerative hierarchical clustering algorithm. The dataset is imported and named as X and converted to NumPy array. In the next steps, the number of clusters is determined using the heuristic approach mentioned earlier. The hierarchy module from the SciPy cluster package is imported. The dendrogram is built using dendrogram function together with the Watt linkage and plotted with pyplot. The number of clusters is then determined using the heuristic approach mentioned earlier. This number of clusters is used in the next step of fitting the hierarchical clustering model to the data. This is done with the agglomerative clustering function of the cluster module of scikit-learn. The number of clusters is set to 3. The default Euclidean distance is used and the linkage is the same as before. Finally, the scatter plot is used to visualize the clusters. The plot scatter function plots the samples belonging to each cluster. The expressions y underscore h3 equals 2, y underscore h3 equals 0, and y underscore h3 equals 1. Select the observations assigned to cluster 1, 2, and 3 respectively, while the PC1 and PC2 scores define the x and y axis coordinates. The remaining parameters determine the overall appearance of the plot. Remember that hierarchical clustering returns cluster indices starting from 0 because Python uses zero-based indexing. The resulting dendrogram from the wine data is shown, and it can be seen that a horizontal line drawn through the largest vertical gap intersects 3 branches, indicating that the optimal number of clusters is 3. The comparison between the principal component plot and the agglomerative hierarchical clustering result is shown. In the PC plot, the known class information is used only to color the samples for visualization and was not used during the principal component analysis itself. Likewise, the class labels were not provided to the agglomerative hierarchical clustering algorithm. Despite this, the hierarchical clustering was able to group most of the samples according to their original classes. Only some samples located at the boundaries between the three classes were grouped into regions associated with other classes. These samples are indicated by arrows or oval outlines. Overall, the clustering results closely resemble the known class structure of the wine dataset. Hierarchical clustering offers several advantages. It is a flexible method that can be applied to both continuous and categorical data depending on the similarity or distance measure used. Unlike K-means clustering, it does not require the number of clusters to be specified in advance when constructing the dendrogram. However, the final clustering results can vary depending on the choice of similarity matrix and linkage method. Hierarchical clustering can also impose a hierarchical structure even when no true hierarchy exists in the data. Finally, because it repeatedly computes distance between clusters, the algorithm becomes computationally expensive for very large datasets, can also be sensitive to outliers and noise. Agglomerative hierarchical clustering supports the earlier conclusion obtained from K-means clustering, suggesting that the wine dataset contains three natural groups. While both methods produce similar results in this example, no single clustering algorithm is universally the best choice. The most appropriate algorithm depends on the characteristics of the data, the distance matrix used, and the assumptions underlying the method. In future videos, we will explore density-based clustering using dbScan as well as other machine learning techniques for classification and regression to better understand the strengths and limitations of different approaches. Thank you for your time. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep turning data into knowledge.